Good morning and happy Juneteenth weekend. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here at the Jim-Ree Museum in beautiful downtown Elberton, Georgia, to celebrate this wonderful day. With so many holidays or so many events, sometimes it feels, what's the connection? Obviously it means a lot to all of us, but I love it when there's an actual perfect or when there's a good connection between our community and what we're actually celebrating. And we are very blessed that in 1924, a gentleman by the name of William Henry Hurd recorded an autobiography of his life story. William Henry Hurd was born a slave here in Elberton County and was 15 years old in 1865 when he was freed as a slave. Mr. Hurd wrote a book, From the Slavery to the Bishopric, and it's a tremendous book. There's a copy of it online. It's relatively easy to find if you just Google his name. But this book has become one of my favorite books because it contains so much history. We have a perfect snapshot of what was going on in his life in Elberton County and the city of Elberton during these tremendous events in historical times. But in his book, he has a chapter that is, to me, what Juneteenth is all about. And if you'll please, I would like to share that with you. It's chapter 2, First and Second Times Sold as a Slave. My father, George W. Hurd, was a slave of Thomas Hurd, who was reputed to be his father. He was a blacksmith by trade, and while he only weighed 140 pounds, he could use a sledgehammer as steadily and actively as a man weighing 200, and shoe as many mules as any blacksmith in the county. After 30 years of blacksmith, he took up the trades of a wheelwright and a carpenter, and worked all three of these trades 20 years before he died. He didn't know figures well, but he could give a bill for lumber as accurately as a master mathematician. But he never belonged to the same man that my mother belonged to, although he did live near enough to see her once or twice a week. My mother was Parthenia Galloway. She and her children belonged to the Galloway estate, 2 boys, Wiley and George Galloway. When the boys became of age and the estate was settled, my mother and 3 children were placed upon the auction block and sold to the highest bidder. Now, my understanding is that this auction actually occurred in Elberton County. That man was Lindsay Smith, who lived at Rock Fence in the flat woods of Elberton County. He was a large farmer and owned nearly 100 Negroes. This was my first time sold. After 2 or 3 years at Rock Fence, a man by the name of John A. Trenchard, principal of the high school at Elberton, Georgia, wanted to buy a cook. He came to Lindsay Smith, who had a woman by the name of Harriet and her children to sell. But Professor Trenchard saw us children and asked the woman who was the mother of these children, and he was shown my mother. There were then 4 children, as Cordelia, my youngest sister, had just been born. But the difference in the sale was $1,000 more. Mr. Trenchard paid the difference and purchased my mother and her 4 children, Millie, Henry, Beverly, and Delia. We went to Elberton. Now they were out on Long Street and they came into the city. My mother became a cook, and the 2 of us, large enough to do errands, became house servants, as Professor Trenchard kept a boarding house and many of the students boarded with him. This was my second and last time to be sold as a slave. Professor Trenchard was an Iowa man and what we considered a fair master, but there were many men in Georgia very cruel as masters, for the law did not interfere with the master and the slave. It had nothing to do with his treatment of them, as there was no law in vogue as to cruelty to animals in those days. I knew a man living just miles from us who beat a woman belonging to him to death, and she was heavily pregnant. He was guilty of murder of 2 and not just 1. The masters had cruel overseers and Negro drivers who were allowed to beat the Negroes but not take life. Many men and women, this is in Elberton, resented this cruelty and would fight back. But the overseers would overpower them, and the master would stand by to see, put 100 lashes on their bare backs, wash them with salt and water. The blood ran from their heads to the heels, yet many of them were never conquered. They would go into the woods and stay for months, yes, some of them years. They would dig caves in the ground and live with them. They would get the Negro hounds to trail and catch them, but many of them would take a scythe and cut the hounds to pieces as they approached. Others had remedies that they could use so the hounds could not scent them, so they could not be trailed. He says, I know a woman who could not be conquered by her mistress, so her master threatened her to sell her to New Orleans slave traders. She was so determined, she put her right hand on the meat block and cut off 3 fingers to make the sale impossible. This is real, and this was here. And that's what's amazing to me is to know this. But he continues that typhoid fever broke out as an epidemic in Elberton County. My oldest sister and my mother died. Myself, Beverly, Cordelia, and George Clark were left as orphans, and I was 9 years old, the oldest of the 4. George Clark, the youngest, was only 5 weeks old. William Henry Hurd was 9 years old with a 5-week-old child and got transferred to a new slave owner. He was not sold, but transferred. And when I was 10 years old, I began working on his farm. A plow was made just to suit my height, and I plowed day after day, and so it went until 1865. One day, in 1865, I was plowing with a mare called Old Jane, and I looked up and saw the Yankees. I had heard before of their coming. I took out Old Jane and went to the house about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was asked why had I come home at that hour. I told them I was afraid the Yankees would steal my horse, so I brought her home. But that was not the cause at all. Freedom had come, and I came to meet it. 4 weeks after that, I was stacking hay, and the boss man came out to see where we were. He was under the influence of drink, and he beat everybody. And that night, I took all of my belongings, I put them in a pocket handkerchief, and went to freedom. Thus ended slavery with me. I don't know who will see this or hear, but to anyone in this community that wants to know your worth, that wants to know your value, that wants to know your place, I want you to know that it's here. Men and women for 100, 200 years have been fighting in this community to make a more equal and just world. I'm honored today to be a part of that celebration. I hope that you will cherish your value, your importance. Everybody that's listening to this, if it's 2 people or 200, you are a critical and essential part of who we are as a community. And I'm so grateful for you. I thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about William Henry Hurd. I thank you for the opportunity to celebrate this wonderful weekend. God bless you all.